There is a specter haunting Eastern Europe, the specter of what in the West is called dissent. With these words, Czech playwright and dissident Václav Havel began his famous 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, which gave hope to millions crushed by the communist state in Czechoslovakia behind the Iron Curtain. Dr. Flagg Taylor on Václav Havel and his two powerful essays, The Power of the Powerless and Stories and Totalitarianism, now. My name is Todd Wonder, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Dr. Flagg Taylor teaches in the Department of Political Science at Skidmore College. He has been a visiting fellow at the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University and serves on the Academic Council of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. His teaching ranges widely in the history of political philosophy and in the American political tradition. Most of his writing and research has been focused in three areas. First, totalitarianism and dissent. Second, liberalism. And third, American constitutionalism and executive power. He is currently working on a book that investigates the moral, political, and philosophical dilemmas at work in the dissident movement in the former Czechoslovakia in the 1970s and 1980s. His last book is an edited collection of the essays of Czech dissident Václav Benda called The Long Night of the Watchman. Flagg is also the host of Enduring Interest, a compelling podcast on books and ideas. Flagg, welcome.
Thanks, Todd. It's great to be here. I'm a fan of the podcast, so it's a real treat to be a guest.
Segment 1, Playwright and Dissident. In 1989, having been elected president of the Czech Republic after years of hardship as a playwright and dissident, Václav Havel shocked an audience at Hebrew University, saying this, quote, I am the kind of person who would not be in the least surprised if in the very middle of my presidency I were to be summoned and led off to stand trial before some shadowy tribunal or taken straight to a quarry to break rocks. Nor would I be surprised if I were to suddenly hear reveille and wake up in my prison cell and then, with great bemusement, proceed to tell my fellow prisoners everything that had happened to me in the past 6 months. The lower I am, the more proper my place seems. And the higher I am, the stronger my suspicion is that there's been some mistake. So, Flagg, before we begin our discussion on Václav Havel, how did you find yourself interested in and dedicating your life to, among other interests, the study of totalitarianism and Eastern European dissidents?
So I was trained as a political philosopher, and that's the primary focus of my teaching. You know, all the great books from Plato on up to Tocqueville. But when I was writing my dissertation, I had a few friends who encouraged me to study and read Solzhenitsyn and Havel and a Polish poet called Czesław Miłosz. I had always been interested in communism, but hadn't quite figured out a way to kind of marry my training in political philosophy with my interest in communism. And some of these friends of mine, one of whom you've had on the podcast, Dan Mahoney,
Sure.
kind of convinced me that there was a kind of substantive way to connect my interest in communism with political philosophy and the grand themes like tyranny and ethical questions of responsibility and the like. And so I edited a book, I think it was published in 2011, called The Great Lie, which was primarily driven by a need for me to compile these great thinkers on the subject of totalitarianism between two covers. I had been teaching this class at Skidmore as a kind of adjunct, and I was photocopying things from different books and handing them out to my students, and just thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if there was one book that brought together these great analysts of totalitarianism in one place. And so that's where it really all started. And then after that book came out, I decided I wanted to take a more focused, kind of particularistic view of the subject. And I sort of came down to, do I want to go to Poland or Czechoslovakia? My mother, this is my 40th birthday, my mother gave me a trip to Europe. And I had some friends who had done a Fulbright in the former Czechoslovakia, and so they put me in touch with some of the dissidents, and so it was really a kind of fortuitous chain of events that brought together this 40th birthday trip with some casual conversations with some interesting people, and in Prague, and that kind of launched me on this path to study totalitarianism, right, in the former Czechoslovakia, and really get a chance to spend a lot of time with these incredibly impressive people who risked a lot to dissent from the regime.
I want to say also, if Mrs. Taylor, if you're listening to this podcast, we give you a great credit for sending your son to Europe because a lot. I mean, I will. I want to really endorse the book, The Great Lie, which if it's, I know there's available copies out there, and I would absolutely endorse a re-release of this. I have not seen any more thorough collection of the works, compelling works of dissidents who lived in the crucible of oppression, speaking about the nature of what it means to be human, the nature of dignity in an undignified, oppressive environment. The Great Lie is extraordinary. So again, Mrs. Taylor, thank you for that European trip for your son. It changed my life, and I know it changed his. So that I think that's amazing. The other thing, Flag, I want to actually ask you this also. How much did your rooting in political philosophy that brought about the American enterprise, the American democracy, and a lot of Western civilization? How much did knowing kind of what's right about political philosophy help you in understanding what was wrong with political philosophy when it goes in the wrong direction, like in communism, National Socialism, fascism? What did your rooting in functional political philosophy teach you about dysfunctional political philosophy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Two quick things come to mind. One, my study of liberalism and thinkers like Montesquieu and Tocqueville, they taught me kind of how to think deeply about what's necessary to sustain a free society. And so I do think that all of that background kind of provided an important counterpoint. But then I think, and this is actually where I think modern contemporary political science, as it's kind of studied and taught today, I don't think we pay close attention enough to tyranny in general and totalitarianism in particular, and what it means when freedom is lost. What happens to the human personality in such conditions? How is it that people are able to kind of I don't know, stomach these unfree atmospheres and kind of normalize it in their own minds for so long? I think that's kind of an understudied topic. And so I think that parallelism of studying, what's necessary to sustain a free liberal society versus, right, how does modern tyranny sustain itself, um, and kind of convince its citizens to kind of go along with these really strange, oppressive regimes. That was all, I think, quite important to me studying. And then the second thing I would say is what really attracted me to the question of totalitarianism was that it made me see in a kind of concrete way how some of the transcendent problems that people had explored, back with Plato and Aristotle, right, come to show themselves in the 20th century, right? So
Mm.
it just sort of convinced me of I don't know, the ongoing relevance of these permanent human questions of political and moral responsibility. The case of totalitarianism in general and communism in particular just made these moral questions kind of come alive,
Yeah.
and it just reminded me of how important these texts that, at some level, right, you're always tempted to say, what can Plato possibly, teach us about X or Y today? But if you look at some of the political conditions and political questions that people like Havel ask themselves, it's not at all different from some of the characters in the Platonic dialogues. These questions of what Socrates is trying to investigate. So it just convinced me of the permanence of these human questions, and showed me that the concrete circumstance in which these questions arrive, can make these important, enduring questions come alive in a way that, it's often easy to kind of forget how these things are really live questions.
It is interesting how enduring human nature is and human appetites are, and it's when I'm teaching medical students and residents, some excerpt from Shakespeare or from Dostoevsky or Dante, that may have to do with nuances of a patient concern or what have you, they sometimes wonder, why are we reading this? What's the relevance of this to now? And
Right.
this is there's a thread of human nature, human appetite, vice, virtue, etc., desire that transcends culture, transcends time, transcends language, and to your point, that's what you're putting your finger on. Let's talk about Václav Havel. So many people have never heard the name, especially those who weren't alive kind of in the 70s and the 80s, or at least aware of the international political circumstance. Who, Flag, was Václav Havel?
So he was born in near Prague in 1936 and died in 2011. He was born to a pretty wealthy family, but that he was born a few years before the Nazi occupation, and then in 1948, the Communist Party took power through a coup in Czechoslovakia, and so he and his families, their property was divested. They were obviously considered bourgeois and kind of a threat because of who they were, and so he wasn't allowed to study. He had compulsory military service, and eventually in the 1960s found his way working as a stagehand in a theater. Got interested in plays and playwriting. In the 1960s turned out to be a time where things started to loosen up a little bit in Czechoslovakia. It was still, I would still certainly call it totalitarianism, but censorship laws were loosened a little bit. It was somewhat easier to travel, and so I think it's 1965. A couple of his plays were actually allowed to be put on in Prague, and this brought him almost immediate international attention. People noticed these plays and their strangeness and their depth, and so it made him somewhat of a celebrity. Um, Prague Spring happens in 1968. This was a kind of reform movement within the Communist Party, and this was quickly crushed by the Soviets. The Prague Spring is when the Soviets and I think 5 other Warsaw Pact countries' armies invade, and they take all of the so-called reform communists out, and kind of crack down. They undertake this vast and thoroughgoing review of the party's mistakes. They purge, I think, I don't know, a third to a fourth of the party membership, and they introduced what was called the normalization regime. This is the period of the 1970s and 80s that Havel writes so much about in his dissident essays. Anyway, after the Prague Spring, Havel's plays are not allowed to be put on anymore. He is paid close attention to by the secret police. He's watched all the time, and he lives a kind of quiet life. But in 1975, he writes a famous letter to Gustav Husak, who's the general secretary of the Communist Party. This is his first kind of very public dissident essay that circulated in Samizdat, circulated underground. And then he's part of this organization called Charter 77. In 1977, this organization is formed to kind of hold the communist government to account. It had been a signatory to the Helsinki Accords, which meant that all these specific countries incorporated these human rights guarantees into their individual constitutions. And so this gave the charter a kind of way to say, we're not doing anything illegal. We're just asking you to abide by these laws that you yourself as a government signed. Um, Shortly after the charter movement is born, Havel goes to prison for 3 years. He's let out in 1982 for ill health. And he continues writing and publishing as a kind of dissident and member of the charter throughout the 80s. Berlin Wall falls in 1989, as you know, and because of Havel's prominence as a kind of public-facing dissident, he's part of this group called the Civic Forum, which was a kind of umbrella group for all the different people and organizations who had kind of protested the oppression of the communist government. And as you mentioned in your introduction, then he is elected to be the first president of post-communist Czechoslovakia. And then when Czechoslovakia splits in 1993, he is elected to be the first president of the Czech Republic. He's elected again for a second 5-year term, and then I think he's sort of out of politics in 2003, if memory serves, and continues on writing and wrote a couple plays and a very interesting memoir after that. And then, as I said, he dies in 2011. And so, as you alluded to in that speech too from Hebrew University, Havel himself was very aware of the kind of if you wrote a play about his life, people would think was an absurd
Come
fairy
on.
tale, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was just crazy. I mean, I think were it not for living under communism, he probably would have been quite happy as a playwright and not particularly interested in politics really. And so to go from kind of playwright to dissident to all the way up to president, I think it's a kind of fairy tale that
Yeah.
never ceased to kind of astound him. And so he writes and speaks very beautifully about the kind of strange quality of his own life.
Flagg, I want to. This is a wonderful summary. So, thank you for that. I want to step back to his plays that kind of got him this international attention, and then got the eyes of the communist state kind of peering in on him. Were the plays he was writing, were they pokes at the communist bear? Was that were those the seeds of him beginning a dissident before his 1975 open letter that you mentioned, or were they just edgy enough, artistic enough and popular enough to make him someone that the communist state would be nervous about? So was it more of a dissident? We're seeing a dissident and early seeds of being a dissident, or was it more this is an artsy guy that might get a following and could be a threat for being popular, and we got to kind of keep an eye on him? Which, or was it both? What's your sense?
Yeah, my sense is both. So in the plays, you will not see explicit mentions of communism at all, right? So it's not the case that he is poking the bear, as you said, in any obvious and direct way. However, that said, if you see the play performed or read these plays, it's hard not to notice that he's thinking about the situation that has been created by communism, right? And so there's a play called The Memorandum that's about the invention of a new language and the bureaucracy that sustains this experiment in a new language. And so all his plays are very bizarre, very strange, but they're meant to get people to reflect on, I think, the situation in which they found themselves. He talks about in a few of his essays and some of his letters, actually, he talks about his plays all being an investigation of what he calls absurdity.
Hmm.
And I think if memory serves, I don't have the quote at hand, but he says something. His definition of absurdity is something that should aspire to meaning that doesn't aspire to meaning. And so a lot of his plays are an investigation of kind of the strangeness of this vacuous world that people find themselves in, rooted in kind of mind-numbing bureaucracy and anonymity, and again conditions created by communism, again, but with no explicit reference, to the fact that this party in this country is doing all this. And so this is in a way why I think his plays have found audiences in lots of different countries, right? Because lots of people have, even if you don't have any direct experience of communism, lots of people in their own lives have an experience of the frustrations of anonymous bureaucracy.
Yeah.
And so his plays in that sense transcend place and time. But I guess to go back just to answer your question directly, I think it's a kind of it's more they were worried about him because of the fact that he would be gain a following and be popular and could really speak to people, but they also couldn't ignore and didn't ignore, I don't think, the fact that these plays were at minimum indirectly about what was going on in the country.
It's interesting, not that Havel necessarily aligns with the John Paul II, you know, Catholic worldview perfectly, but it makes me think of, Karol Wojtyła, the kind of in the Rhapsodic Theater, that they were having this underground Polish plays being performed by a
Yeah,
group
yeah.
of friends and keeping the cultural memory alive in the midst of either Nazi occupation or communist occupation. And as Karol Wojtyła is being elevated to archbishop and so on and cardinal, etc. I think it was when he became archbishop, one of his enemies or detractors kind of dismissed him as a poet. He's a poet. He's kind of a dreamer. And so it's interesting that so. And that was back earlier on, and a little bit earlier, obviously, than Havel. But it seems that the powers that be with Havel, again, this not necessarily as a Catholic dissident per se, whereas they dismissed John Paul II or Karol Wojtyła as a kind of a dreamer poet that probably would be controllable and never have his feet on the ground of real politics, so to speak. Havel could be pursued as a potential danger just only a couple decades later, partly because of his poetic imagination and so on. So it's interesting how much the poetic imagination can actually be a real a hand in the door, cracking the door open against ideology and be a real threat to totalitarian regimes, which we're going to talk about in just a few minutes.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, the situation you just talked about too with John Paul. I mean, this is the case with Havel in the 1970s. I'll bring this up because we'll probably get to
Yeah.
it when we move to the essays. But Havel starts writing plays again in the early 70s and performs them, with his friends at his little country house north of Prague. And they get in the habit of staging these plays just for kind of their little group. And it forces them to kind of think about their situation in a poetic way. And I think it kind of keeps Havel in particular, kind of keeps him sane. It keeps
Mm.
his mind active. And it it helps him get through the period. I mean, he talks about this in Stories in Totalitarianism, but just this sense that of hopelessness and nothing ever changing, and just this kind of tiresome pressure that
Yeah.
they felt in the 70s. And so yeah, I think pursuing his artistic talents and sharing those with the friends around him, this was a crucial thing for him to kind of sustain himself. And then he wouldn't have known it, but sustained him for the kind of battle to come in the late 70s.
So, Flagg, you said he's born in 1936, and just as if my memory of history serves, the Munich Pact happened in September of 1938.
Yep.
The Sudetenland is basically partitioned off from Czechoslovakia. That's the western portion. That's not Prague, if I remember correctly. So,
Yep.
but so a mere 6 months later, the Nazis kind of violate their agreement with the Munich Pact, take over the rest of Czechoslovakia, and so from 1938 until I don't know if it was in the early, I don't know, 1944ish or maybe it's 45 even. From that time, 40 or 38 till the middle 40s, they're under Nazi occupation, and then the next thing we know, like you said, in 1948, ultimately, it's now a communist uprising or communist takeover of society. So he goes from one ideological oppressive environment as a young boy. I mean, he's 2 years old in 1938, but it's,
Right.
some of his formative years in his early childhood. And then he moves right into another form of ideological oppression from 48 all the way through till 1989. Can you say just a few words? And you've mentioned this about the bourgeois family being sort of expropriated of their possessions and so on. How, can you just say a few words? Probably obvious, but a few words about how was Havel formed under these constant oppressions he experienced day in and day out for those early years?
um I mean, I think the most important aspect of it, just from the standpoint of him really, I guess not. I mean, I guess my first reaction is some of it must have just felt normal, right? He didn't
Yeah,
know
yeah.
any other life. I mean, certainly his parents and his family could could speak to him about pre totalitarian pre-occupation world. His uncle was a very successful kind of film magnate, and his family even built some of the important kind of commercial centers in Prague, and so I suspect that his I don't know much about his childhood, but I suspect his family would have been acutely aware of what had been lost. But I think what formed him maybe most importantly was just the fact that he couldn't study what he wanted,
Yeah.
and kind of floundered around and found himself in working as a stagehand in a theater. And so that that was an important kind of detail about his biography. I guess the last thing I'd say on that is that um, he found himself partially because of the circles his family ran in, connected to interesting people, novelists and artists. And so I suspect he was listening to what these people were saying, who are
Yeah.
probably older than him.
Yeah.
Um, Milos Forman, the famous director, I think he and his family knew other Czech film directors. Um, and so just swimming in these circles of artists kind of gave him a taste and an appreciation for maybe what had been lost, because of the communist regime
So you mentioned that he had in 1975 he wrote the open letter to the, if I'm not mistaken, the Secretary General of the
of the
Communist
party.
Party.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
that's of the in the Soviet Union, or is that's
No, in
in
Czechoslovakia.
Czechoslovakia?
Yeah, yeah,
So he takes the step. I think he's 39 years old, or roughly 39, 40. What made him? I mean, now he's gonna put a big target on him if he didn't have on his back if he didn't have it already. What made him object? What was the tipping point? Do you have a sense about what the tipping point that led to this letter?
yeah. So he had been involved in some oppositional activity in 1968, in the months leading up to the Prague Spring. He was part of a writers' union, and so he was at some of these meetings where writers began to be much more openly critical about the regime, right, than they had been in previous years in the 1960s. And so we have some of his essays that I think probably started off as kind of statements written for these writers union meetings. And so he had kind of dabbled in opposition activities, but nothing ever as kind of confrontational as this letter to Gustav Husak. And what he says in some of his essays and his autobiographical writings about this is that he was tired of being tired.
Hmm.
He was tired of feeling a sense of hopelessness that would lead to kind of paralysis. And so he wasn't sure what to do, how to get out of it, but he just wanted to make sense of the situation in the country, and then put the powers that be on notice that he understood what was going on and they should not be fooled. And so what he says, I mean, I'll just give you a very, very brief encapsulation of the first part of that Goose letter to
Yeah,
Husak.
please.
So this is, remember, Husak is the general secretary that's put in place to normalize life. So in other words, we as a party made a mistake somewhere along the line in the 1960s. We allowed this reform movement to go, to get out of control, such that the Soviets had to crack down. We need to restore a normal communist regime. We need to get back to the place where we were before we had all this weird experimentation and communist thinking that they could follow their own path. And so they have this purge, they have this crackdown, and it led to a kind of pacification of society. It led to people really retreating in a much more explicit way than they had been, even before 1960. And so Havel's looking around and he sees this kind of stasis, this kind of quietism,
Hmm.
and he thinks, okay, these Communist Party members think that they've offered people a bargain and people have taken the bargain, and so everything is fine. In other words, it's almost like he's giving it's almost like Havel. I think I've said this to someone else on another podcast, but it's almost like Havel is giving a response to the State of the Union address.
Yeah.
You say the country is X. You say it's doing well. It's pacified. People have accepted the bargain. But let me tell you, people have not accepted the bargain. People have accepted it insofar as they're scared. They're fearful of the secret police. They're paralyzed by the presence of the secret police, and that's not people being satisfied. That's people being watched and oppressed by this state. And so I think after writing this letter, he said, finally, I've said something true about the world, and I've said it to someone who's in a position to do something about it.
Hmm.
And I don't think he thought that, the general secretary would say, "Oh, you're right, Václav. Maybe we should, loosen the reins a little bit." But nonetheless, I think it was an important thing for his own person, and secondly, it was important for his fellow dissidents to kind of see that someone's willing to take this risk, and maybe there should be more opportunities for people to speak out and speak truth to power, so to speak.
Segment 2: The Power of the Powerless. Ideology, according to Václav Havel, is one of the pillars of the totalitarian system's external stability. This pillar, however, is built on a very unstable foundation. It is built on lies. It works only as long as people are willing to live within the lie. So, Flagg, let's move forward from 1975 when he writes this open letter to 1978 when he pens The Power of the Powerless, this powerful essay that was distributed through the samizdat, as you said, the kind of the
Hmm.
underground circles and so on. Can you say a few words about the premise of The Power of the Powerless, and why Havel wrote it?
Yeah, so the particular circumstances of the essay come about because the Charter 77 movement, had been in place for a year, and it was going through a kind of crisis. It had attracted some people to its fold in those initial months. It was, new and exciting, but the government cracked down quite hard, and encouraged people, jailed some people, encouraged some people to emigrate who were involved with it. And so there was a kind of meeting of the bigwigs in the charter movement. What do we do next? What can we change? What can we do differently? How do we move forward given this harsh crackdown? And Václav Benda wrote an essay, and he brought this essay to this meeting, and it's called the Parallel Polis.
Hmm.
And it encouraged people to kind of rethink the strategy of the charter. I won't get sidetracked by Benda now, but Havel's essay was a kind of response to Benda's essay, and a kind of thinking through of some of its premises. And so the essay is in part an effort to kind of reinvigorate the charter movement, get it the charter to appreciate its roots and its foundations. But it was also an important essay because it speaks very directly. You probably noticed this. He speaks very directly, I think, to the West. He
Yeah.
wants people in the West to really understand what these dissidents are up to, who they are, why they're doing what they're doing. Havel, of course, is quite worried that people in the West will kind of put dissidents in these categories of Western political life and see them as a kind of political opposition, and make the mistake of um, thinking that, oh, what you're doing over there is what politics is like over here. And so I think another of Havel's purposes in the essay is to really get people in the West to appreciate the specific situation that the dissidents are operating in, and therefore really get them to appreciate what it means to live in a totalitarian regime in general, and of course a communist regime in particular. And so the other thing that's interesting about this essay is it has all these different audiences that he's speaking to at the same time. I think he's speaking to his fellow citizens,
Hmm.
trying to get them to appreciate the situation that they're in. Lots of people would have understood what Havel was talking about, but they wouldn't have self-consciously uh, recognized sort of the dilemmas that are at work. And so I think he's trying to get people, his fellow citizens, to appreciate with a greater level of acuity what has been lost by the compromises that they're making. He's trying to motivate his fellow dissidents to understand the situation that they face. And he's speaking to the West, trying to get people in the West to appreciate the peculiar situation of these people, and people that he assumes, right, can have no real connection or appreciation to what it would mean, to live in a totalitarian regime. And this is why uh, people in Russia and other places who had read Orwell's 1984 in translation, right, they were always stunned that Orwell had never lived in any of these
Yeah.
regimes. They were like, "What? How did this guy figure this out?" So I think Havel has that sense of people in the West just won't get it, and so I really need to explain kind of the logic of this regime and how it affects our daily lives.
When you mentioned that, it reminds me of an essay, or maybe it was a speech he gave in absentia, but the anatomy of a reticence, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken, where
yeah,
he's
yeah.
he's sort of addressing kind of the dreamy notion of this some of the Western peace movement that's on the outside of the Iron Curtain that has certain kind of very naive assessments of kind of, well, I don't know if it's the two scorpions in the bottle of the United States and and the USSR are both, they both have their powers, and we got to be careful how we interpret them. But the dissidents were sort of being appropriated by some of these Western peace movements to serve the Western peace movement's agendas, and not really fully understanding what it's like to live behind the Iron Curtain. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Havel was sort of expressing a little bit of a skepticism about how much he could sidle up with those people as allies, because he's not sure what their agenda would be. Am I understanding that or remembering that correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's called An Anatomy of Reticence. That essay actually comes about because there had been some meeting in Prague. Um, it was I can't remember if it was explicitly connected to a peace movement, but Western peace activists were there and charter people were there. And at this point, you probably know the philosopher and thinker Roger Scruton.
Hmm.
He was connected to this to the underground kind of dissident movement. He had an educational foundation that was involved with some of these dissidents. And Scruton wrote a letter, a kind of open letter, not specifically to Havel or Benda, but to people in the dissident movement, and said, "Hey, you shouldn't, these peace activists are not people that you should be, working with." And the response from Havel and Benda and others was, I mean, it wasn't the same response, but one of their responses was, we gotta work with whoever's willing to work with us. We
Hmm.
can't pick and choose our allies. We have to be open. We're not naive about who some of these people are. At the same time, we have to have a kind of certain openness in who we speak to, given our situation. But Havel also wrote this essay that was meant, I think, to be quite critical, as you said, of the Western leaders and peace activists who he thought were completely naive about the situation behind the Iron Curtain. And so that essay was prompted by them grappling with, who can really be our allies, who can we rely on, who should we dialogue with. And so that dilemma was an important dilemma that the dissidents had to face. And that essay that you mentioned, that's one of the harsher essays.
Hmm.
I mean, Havel generally is very, I think, gentle even when he's critical. I think that's one of the less gentle essays that that he
Yeah.
wrote.
You know, I want to give you, in the introduction we mentioned that you had written a book, the Long Night of the Watchman. I know you said you didn't want to go on a tangent, and that was being courteous, but I want you just to say the Parallel Polis that was written by Václav Benda. Can you just say a word about that? And because as I've read your work, it's pointed to that as a very seminal work in the dissident community, a nucleus around which a lot of ideas kind of for the dissident community kind of emerged. Can you just say a word or two about the Parallel Polis from Václav Benda?
Sure. So Benda was someone who came to the charter organization later. He was not one of the original, I think, 240 some members. He signed the charter um, I think 8 or 9 months after it had already been launched. And so he's a kind of latecomer to the movement, but he quickly becomes part of the inner circle. Interesting guy because he's a very faithful Catholic and conservative in a kind of Roger Scruton sense of the word conservative, and so ran in different circles than kind of Havel intellectual artistic circles. Benda comes from this kind of Catholic background and connected with some of the priests, some of the church members in former Czechoslovakia. Anyway, his and maybe we can this is a good kind of launching pad to talk about Power of the Powerless and just different ways of framing the question of dissent. But Benda's argument in that essay is you can't motivate people to kind of join a dissident movement by these seemingly abstract appeals to principle. That something else needs to drive people to protest. It has to come from something deep inside them about their everyday life. And so his idea was to construct what he called the parallel polis. Basically, what he meant was, something you already mentioned in the case of Poland. There was an underground music scene in Czechoslovakia. There was an underground church. There was an underground educational, the Flying University in Poland, the underground educational institutions developing. So his argument was develop these alternative institutions, give people a taste for real education, real friendship, kind of the concrete experiences of social life from which that have been robbed from them, right, by the state. And once people got a taste for these kind of concrete human social experiences, that would kind of reactivate them and get them to be interested in dissent from the standpoint of protecting this thing that they, were taking great joy in and benefit from. And so it was only through these kind of, in other words, rebuilding what Tocqueville would have called civil society, kind of reactivate people's social, social lives. And once you did that, you could sort of build the movement out from these alternative spheres. And it had an important effect on thinking in Czechoslovakia and even Poland too. That essay was circulated in the Eastern Bloc generally, and so I think Benda made an important contribution in that essay.
It's interesting. You remind me of what happened under the Nazis, with Gleichschaltung, the kind of the bringing in the coordinating of civil society, not just political society, but civil society, the Nazification, if you will, of everything from bowling clubs to shooting clubs to, the League of German Maidens or the Hitler Youth. It wasn't going to be the Catholic, youth organization, it was going to be the Hitler Youth and so on, that they needed to fill the mortar of society had to be Nazified, not just the bricks of the politics, so to speak. And it sounds like you're saying, Benda is saying we need to reclaim our civil society in some fashion because that's the soul of our society. It's what John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła was doing with the Rhapsodic Theater and so on. Let's dive into the power of the powerless. Let's go to the most kind of vivid character in this entire essay, which I think is the green grocer. So how does this green grocer, the person who runs effectively, I think, a grocery store, how does he figure into the narrative of this essay?
Yeah, so Havel uses this character as just an example to illustrate how ideology operates in a communist regime. And so the greengrocer puts up a sign in the window every morning when he comes to work, and the sign says, "Workers of the world unite." And so Havel asks in this essay, does the greengrocer actually think the workers are going to unite at some point in the future? Does he think this would be a good thing? Right. And Havel says, no, this guy probably doesn't even think about the content of the sign. He's probably quite cynical about the content of the sign. He puts the sign up because it's a signal to everyone that he is not a troublemaker. And so while he's not participating, you could say, in the sort of endorsement of the content of the ideology of the proletarian workers, Havel says at some level he's confirming the state by putting this sign up. And so Havel says, but he says something interesting. He says, what if the sign were to actually say out loud what the sort of message is underlying it? What if the sign says, I'm compliant and obedient, no need to worry about me?
Yeah.
And Havel says, well, then the guy would be much less willing to put the sign up because he'd
Right.
be faced with this public affirmation of his own compliance. And so Havel says, what ideology is, the way that it operates, is that hides from people the low foundation of their obedience. So it allows them to confirm the system, but do so in a way that they can hide behind this high sounding slogan. And Havel says, this incident of the sign, right? This is something that happens in countless different ways at various levels of society, right? So it could be putting up this sign. It could be, right, you were supposed to put up the Soviet flag on any holiday. If you lived in a flat, right, you had to put the Soviet flag out, not just the Czech flag. Right. So, all of these different little tiny kind of microscopic acts that you probably wouldn't notice. All of them, Havel wants to point out, kind of confirm the legitimacy of the system. And so that's what he's trying to emphasize, especially to the Western audience, is the myriad ways that people in these societies are compelled to become part of their own enslavement.
Mm.
If that makes sense.
It does, and this is what gets me. I read this essay years ago, and I've done an awful lot of reading on different books and essays and so on, yours included, on totalitarianism. And I've circled back, obviously, recently for this podcast and rereading this, and I'm just struck by how um, diagnostic this is of human nature, of just
Mm-hmm.
our tendency to avoid trouble, our tendency to rationalize. And his diagnosis and explanation of ideology and its impact is so penetrating into what it means to be human. A quote here I have is, he says, ideology is a veil behind which human beings can hide their own fallen existence, their trivialization, and their adaptation to the status quo. It is an excuse that everyone can use, from the greengrocer who conceals his fear of losing his job behind an alleged interest in the unification of the workers of the world, to the highest functionary whose interest in staying in power can be cloaked in phrases about service to the working class. And that's the end of the quote. But again and again, Havel uses words such as illusion, deceive, veil, conceals, cloak, excuse. All these are used to describe ideology. Its hypnotic effect is central to the power of totalitarian rule. And so Havel would insist ideology acts as the all embracing excuse and as the excuse for each of its parts. So, do you think, as just reading what Havel said, is that a fair assessment of ideology in totalitarian rule from your perspective?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think Havel is probably the best, greatest analysts of ideology in such a context. And the other thing that's I try to emphasize with my students that is, I think, it's so shocking that it's easy to miss when you read the essay, and that is, you sort of alluded to this in your quote, but Havel emphasizes, right, the fact that everyone has to perform this role of confirming the ideology. From the general secretary of the Communist Party, right, has to speak in certain slogans, right. There are certain things that person has to do to kind of confirm the system, down to this very insignificant greengrocer who
Yeah.
who does nothing but put the sign up. And so what Havel says in the essay that I think is shocking if you think it through is, everyone is both a kind of oppressor and oppressed.
Yeah.
And so the normal way we think about politics is to say that there are rulers and then there are the ruled.
Hmm.
And Havel's point in this essay, at least one of his points, is that dichotomy doesn't hold completely true with respect to ideology, that everyone is part of the machinery that perpetuates the system. So no one is guiltless.
Yeah.
And so it ends up being kind of accusatory of
Yeah.
people in the country, right? Is that you all are part of the problem. It's not just the people in the party who are oppressing you, but it's insignificant shopkeeper who do nothing but put up the sign, right? You have to bear some responsibility for the situation in which you find yourself, right? You have to bear some of that. It's not just the party. And I don't know if you think about put yourself in the readership of this essay. Maybe it had come to you in Samizdat and you had to expect it, right? Part of your response might be, who the hell are you to tell me that,
Yeah.
Havel,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I
I'm
want my
just
kid. I want
I'm
my
just
kids
trying
to
to
go
live
to
my
school.
life.
Yeah, I want my kids to go to school. I don't want. I want to keep my. I mean, you really realize there are true dangers. There is risk involved here, and so to your point, it's exactly right. He is putting his finger in the chest of all of us, that kind of where we kind of say, well, it's out of my hands, and I'm going to
Right.
grumble and complain about it. But what can I do? What can anybody do? And it's not that you aren't oppressed. It's not that there aren't consequences. But at the end of the day, this doesn't end by one Superman coming in and knocking off the top. This is a groundswell from the bottom up.
Yeah. And it speaks to, I mean, this is something that I'm trying to think about in my next book, is what constitutes, how are our moral lives constituted? Because one answer to that question is, well, our moral lives are constituted in the will, right? It's primarily in our mind. And so one response to Havel might be, well, look, I'm going to do the best that I can. I'll put up the sign, but I can raise my family according to a kind of different calculus than is the case in this public facing, institutionalized, bureaucratic, communist world, right? I can teach my kids not to do X or Y. I can hold something in reserve, and I'm not really hurting anyone, right? I'm not doing anything. I'm not a prison guard. I'm not.
Yeah,
I haven't been a party member who has been involved in the persecution of people, right? I'm just going to opt out, put the sign up, but live a decent life, and Havel wants to say that understanding of kind of moral action kind of misses the concrete nature of moral action, right? Moral action is what you do every day, and what you do every day can be that can seem insignificant, but if it perpetuates this ideological fiction, that fiction is what legitimizes all of
yeah,
these bad things that are out of your sight.
yeah,
And so I think that's a really important way to kind of think about what moral action is. But again, it must have been hard for some people to stomach for for obvious reasons. It comes off as accusatory.
yeah. Havel writes, each person is capable to a greater or lesser extent of coming to terms with living within the lie. That's his refrain over and over again. Living within the lie. Each
Yeah,
person
yeah,
somehow succumbs to a profane trivialization of his inherent humanity and to utilitarianism. In everyone, there is some willingness to merge with the anonymous crowd and flow comfortably along with it down the river of pseudo life. And what's
yeah,
interesting, what I got from this, again, reading it for the umpteenth time, is the notion that when someone's walking down the street and they see everybody's got the Workers of the World Unite signs in their windows, they almost don't see it because that's just commonplace. What they will see is if someone doesn't put it in their window. And it struck me that to some extent, Havel wasn't necessarily asking this greengrocer again to go out onto the street square with a megaphone and thump his chest and condemn the regime, but he was saying there are steps you can take. You could literally just not put that sign in your window, and that would be a quiet signal to somebody else who therefore might be a little bit emboldened to not wear the pin to the meeting, who might
right,
then influence someone else who's emboldened to maybe write that small message to somebody that condemns the regime, et cetera, et cetera.
right, right.
Is that a fair
Yeah,
characterization?
yeah, that's very well said. That. I mean, he wanted to get people to appreciate. I mean, he said he characterizes the possibility of someone taking down the sign as it had the potential to be like a bacteriological weapon.
Yes.
So the medical metaphor that would hit home with you, I guess.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
you wouldn't know, right, what form, quote unquote dissent might take. Like you said, it might be someone not putting a pin on their lapel. It might be someone refusing to vote, just abstaining from something in a union meeting, right? But I think he wanted people to appreciate the power of these seemingly insignificant actions that they might take.
Yeah. Flag, I want to ask you this, and I'm gonna murder his name. Is it Czesław Milosz? Am I saying it even close to correctly?
Yeah, me. I think the L. What is L in English is Miłosz. It sounds like a W in Polish, but close
Okay.
enough. Yeah, Czesław
Okay.
Miłosz.
He said something along the lines that truth said in a word of truth is like a pistol shot in an empty room, or something along those lines. That in oppressive regimes, when truth is spoken, it's almost, especially totalitarian regimes that brook no dissent. That someone can't speak to the fiction around you without causing that fiction to start to shake and crumble. It's so jarring for truth to be spoken that it's as if a pistol were being shot in an empty room. I want to ask you, and it speaks to Havel's message, what impact does truth have on ideology?
Well, I think over time, it's the thing that will eventually get people to see and be willing to say out loud the falseness of ideology. I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's deadly to ideology, and that's why the regime cracks down on it and suppresses it with such force and power. I mean, it's the one thing they really can't let out, because they know that's going to undermine any of their claims to rule. I mean, the ideology, right? You have to remember, we've been talking very abstractly about ideology, but communist ideology, right, claims to have scientific knowledge
Yeah.
of the movement of history, and the party is supposed to have the party is supposed to be the organization that has understood this knowledge, and it claims to know how to apply this knowledge to political and social life. And so anything that challenges that very direct claim to a certain kind of knowledge, right, has the potential to shake the system. And that's exactly why the legitimacy of such regimes depends upon the constant and myriad omnipresent affirmations of the legitimacy of that ideology. And so once that legitimacy is not affirmed, once that affirmation is kind of taken away, right, that's already dangerous. And that's
Yeah.
not even speaking the truth, right? The guy who takes the sign
Yeah.
down from his window, I mean, strictly speaking, is not speaking the truth, but the fact that he's not affirming the lie
Yeah. Good
is
one.
is bad enough. And so, but to your point, once you get into the a place where people are actually speaking out loud and saying things like, "Oh well, I'll tell you a funny story." Right, um, one of my friends, a dissident friend who was involved in the charter movement, Pavel Bertinka, he told me a story about a friend of his who was, I think, either lost his job or maybe he was jailed. I don't remember the exact punishment, but he had taken a newspaper article out of the Communist Party paper Rude Pravo, that said something like wages rise for the 14th quarter in a row. And then he'd put that, he clipped it out and put it on sort of I don't know, the front of his desk somewhere. But then he clipped a couple of his pay stubs and put that next to the the article, right? And I assume his coworkers saw that, or his manager saw that, and be like, "Yeah, you're gonna have to come with me, buddy."
you're eating lunch alone from now on.
Yeah. So that's more of a speaking the
Yeah.
truth, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so they can't stomach any of that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. The notion of living within the truth instead of living within the lie is so pervasive throughout this entire essay. Finishing up on this one, then moving on to our next one. But let me ask you this, Flag. What was the impact of this essay once it was circulated?
I think everyone recognized it. I mean, people, especially people within the dissident movement, appreciated its clarity and power. I mean, people were, in other words, who were already inclined to kind of go along with the idea, right, that the system was illegitimate. Even for those people, it kind of clarified the stakes and kind of clarified the operation of ideology in such a powerful way that they were grateful for it. Um, in terms of how it affected, people, your sort of average person on the street, it's hard to say because we don't have any figures about, right, who it got to, numbers of
Yeah,
circulation and
sure.
all that. It was an important essay in terms of being circulated in Poland and other countries. We know that dissidents in other countries appreciated it, especially in Poland. They had planned, I think the Czechs and the Poles had planned the publication of kind of joint volume, and this was going to be an essay that was going to appear in a joint volume. That volume never did appear,
Hmm.
but anyway, it was appreciated by people in the dissident world. And then it was published in English in maybe, I forget which, but there were these journals in Western European countries, and in England, the journal was called Encounter. There was a French Encounter eventually moved to the United States. Survey was the British one, but anyway, it appeared in one of these Western journals, and it had an important impact on kind of Western liberal intellectuals who were trying to get people to appreciate the true nature of totalitarianism. So it's his most famous essay for a reason. I mean, in my interviews, I was always skeptical, right? Is this the essay that, just people in the West like for
Yeah.
idiosyncratic reasons? But to a person, when I said, what's Havel's most important essay, even the Czechs are like, oh yeah, it's Power of the Powerless.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, managing editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, Stories and Totalitarianism. A friend of mine who is heavily asthmatic was sentenced, for political reasons, to several years in prison, where he suffered a great deal because his cellmate smoked and he could scarcely breathe. All his requests to be moved to a cell with non-smokers were ignored. His health and perhaps even his life were threatened. An American woman who learned of this and wanted to help telephoned an acquaintance, an editor on an important American daily. Could he write something about it, she asked. Call me when the man dies, was the editor's reply. So, Flagg, these are the opening lines for Václav Havel's Stories and Totalitarianism, an essay written for an underground journal. He goes on to say that news agencies are abandoning Prague because they say nothing is happening here. So, according to Havel, what has become the story in 1988 Czechoslovakia?
The other story, he says, is that there aren't any stories, and he means that both explicitly in the way that you just mentioned with that quote, that journalists don't think there's anything to write about. There's just nothing interesting to report on, and so this is part of Havel's kind of broader project across very different essays to get people to appreciate what he calls post totalitarianism, which is the kind of totalitarianism that existed in the 70s and 80s, and contrast that with just totalitarianism simply, which is what was happening in the late 40s throughout the decade of the 1950s. And he identifies the 1950s as being defined by fanatic adherence to this thing that this project that people, not all people, but some people genuinely believed in. and it was defined by this fanaticism, enthusiasm, but also, of course, real repression. Right, priests were going to uranium mines for 15 years. I mean, it had elements of Soviet repression in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Really, really harsh stuff. And Havel says the atmosphere in the 70s and 80s is very different. It's defined by kind of rituals, bureaucracy, cynicism. People don't seem to believe in much of anything, and therefore journalists don't think much is happening. There's just nothing to write about. And so Havel says there's no stories. And so how do we as Czechs kind of tell the story of having no stories? That's the kind of paradoxical place that he starts from.
It's very interesting because, and that's well said. It reminds me a little bit of this sweeping image of Lenin in the town square with his fist shaking and his brow furrowed, and people just kind of in that revolutionary fervor. And then you see the far end of the communist enterprise, and you see like an ossified gray Chernyenko or Brezhnev, in his later years, and you got to kind of poke them to see if they're still alive, but you still know they have supreme power and
Right.
so on. So this whole notion of a post-totalitarian society, kind of this aging, more ossified degree of oppression versus the torturing, upending, bar brawl kind of beginnings of totalitarianism. So it's history replaced by pseudo history, mystery replaced by predictability, diversity replaced by uniformity. It just seems that this post totalitarian world is reducing everything to a lifeless gray. So why does a deadening bureaucracy seem to replace fervent revolution in these aging totalitarian states?
And so, yeah, this is the really kind of striking thesis about this essay. He says, in a way, he's saying this post totalitarianism, or what others have called kind of late totalitarianism. He says paradoxically, this is really the essence of the system. The essence of the system is not fanaticism, fervent belief, terror. This is really its essence, because of its claims to kind of perfect knowledge, the party has to act on this knowledge with perfect control. And so um, there's this identification with truth and state power. And so this post-totalitarianism is you could say, the perfection of that identification, which and by which he means you really don't need human beings any longer, right? If you've got the world figured out, and the scientific knowledge that you claim to have is really accurate, politics becomes just purely administration, right? I mean, Marx says this, something, the administration of things is going to replace politics as such. And so you just have to have the right bureaucracy in place, the right incentives, the right amount of control, the right amount of compulsion. And once you do that, right, the logic of the system, right, will dictate everything that needs to happen when it needs to happen. You don't need genuine human beings to make judgments about anything. The system will operate on autopilot. And so that's what I think he means. That's what I think he's trying to get people to appreciate as post-totalitarianism being the essence of totalitarianism. This perfectly bureaucratized, perfectly administered world, right? There's no need to exercise genuine human judgment anymore. And this is why, I mean, this is somewhat reflected in the Power of the Powerless essay, right, where he says it doesn't matter who's operating the levers of the bureaucracy. They're just operating these levers according to what the ideology says they should do. And so it gives people, the word that he uses in the Power of the Powerless essay is automatism, which I think is the translator Paul Wilson is trying to be as kind of direct in his translation as possible. It's just the sense that things are on autopilot. And Havel says, and that's why everything is completely uninteresting in this world, right? It crushes any individual initiative. It crushes any interpretation of the world that departs from this single truth that is embodied in the institution of the state. And I think he wants to get across just the horrifying nature of the system, right? He calls it a process of social and historical nihilization.
Yeah.
And so I guess I pointed out kind of the surprisingly accusatory thread in The Power of the Powerless essay. The kind of the surprising thread in this essay is that I think Havel wants to say this post-totalitarian system, in a way, is less human than the 1950s.
Yeah.
Right? The 1950s, there's fanatics, there's enthusiasm, there's horrible repression. As I said, there are people serving in uranium mines and just really shockingly oppressive things. But I think Havel wants to say this system that appears more gentle, right? The oppression is less rigorous, right? Punishments are more gentle, right? You probably won't be sent to a uranium mine. You might lose your job and have to work as a garbage man or something if you
Yeah.
dissent, right? It appears more gentle. It appears less terroristic. It is less terroristic, but in a way, it's less human. And that should, I think he's saying, that should shock you. That should scare you.
You know, it's funny as you say this because I think about how many totalitarian, I mean, true totalitarian systems have there been in history. And obviously, the greatest examples seem to be from the 20th century. But we might begin, and you could correct me because you're the expert on this, but we might begin with some of the French revolutionaries, the Jacobins and the Robespierre and so on, and then kind of move forward and say, okay, you've got the communists, you got the National Socialists, you got fascist Italy, and so on. But we don't have a lot of examples other than say Chinese communism and then Eastern European communism. We don't have a lot of examples of what totalitarianism looks 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 decades into existence. And it's interesting that you say this is for Havel to say this and you to affirm this. This is the end product, guys. And so you almost want you want that to be kind of a warning to those people who are going to go off into their totalitarian fervor and the revolutionary excitement at the front of things. Look down the road and see where this all ends. It doesn't end well. I mean, not just that people die and are in prison and so on, but it ends in the deadening of souls by operators and victims alike. There's a quote I want to give to you. You were speaking to that annihilization. Havel writes, "The war and the killing assume a different form now in the post-totalitarian state. They've been shifted from the daylight of observable public events to the twilight of unobservable inner destruction. It would seem that the absolute classical death, of which one reads in stories, has been replaced here by another kind of death, the slow, secretive, bloodless, never quite absolute, yet horrifyingly ever-present death of non-action, non-story, non-life, non-time, the collectively deadening, or more precisely, anesthetizing process of social and historical nihilization. This nihilization annuls death as such, and thus annuls life as such." And he goes on two more sentences. "Though it sometimes happens in complex and hidden ways, everything that takes place in the public sphere eventually influences and shapes the private sphere. When public life is nihilized, private life is distorted and ultimately nihilized too." Flagg, you alluded to this, but I was wondering, is not the nihilization of a post-totalitarian state, is it a fate worse than death? I mean, how does one live like this? What's your sense about that?
Yeah, that's precisely the why I think he thinks, in a way, the more oppressive phase of communism in Czechoslovakia was more human, right? At least people were sacrificing themselves fanatically, of course, which is not great.
Yeah.
But at least that feels human, that they're dedicating themselves to something due to sincere belief. Whereas, right, in this late post-totalitarian system, it all appears to be the perpetuation of a kind of empty ritual, right? People are utterly cynical. Benda says something in one of his essays about how it was even shocking for people within the party to find people in the party who expressed a modicum of like sincere devotion. So if you were like in a Communist Party meeting and you said something, that reflected, yeah, this is a good thing, people would have been like, what? That Who are you? Like, where did you come from? And so that kind of level of cynicism, I think Havel says should be shocking. And then the other thing that you just mentioned that I would just emphasize is this, just the sensation of helplessness.
Yeah.
And it speaks to what I was saying about how Havel felt in the 1970s, right? That he just felt this overwhelming sense that there was nothing to be done. This system was going to continue for as long as it was going to continue, and right, the best you could do was smoke a few cigarettes, perform a few plays with your friends, and maybe drink many beers as Czechs
Yeah.
like to. But that helplessness, I think Havel was acutely aware of how easy it would be for that to kind of creep into everyone's consciousness. And so he was really attuned to the need to kind of fight that off, as vigorously as possible. And this is why I think Havel had some, even though he was not explicitly or formally a Christian, he had a sense of kind of Christian hope about
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
And I think he wanted to inspire that in other people.
Flagg, was interesting. One of the things he mentioned was that he encountered stories that he had longed for in prison when he met fellow prisoners.
Right.
These are people that could they were all in there. They were all sort of quote unquote enemies of the state, and yet they could speak a little bit more freely, and there was life. Was that striking to you that, again, out in society where you're walking free, everybody kind of averts their eyes and goes about their gray daily existence, and yet there was a fire still alive behind the bars of prisons.
Yeah. This is, now that you mentioned it, that's something I spoke about. I gave some remarks uh, at the Victims of Communism Museum to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. And in those remarks, I emphasize the importance of this chapter called "First Cell, First Love."
Hmm.
It's kind of a shocking chapter title in the Gulag, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And Solzhenitsyn talks about the rediscovery of the we, the first person plural, and how he looked at people without worry in a way, and it was this reactivation of his social life. And Havel appears to be saying something similar in this essay. I think even a little bit more importantly, he's saying you can encounter people who had particular stories to tell, right, about their lives, and were willing to tell them. And he was in prison with Dominic Duka, who would eventually become the Archbishop of Prague. So yeah, he ran across some interesting characters in prison.
As we wind down, I want to give another quote from Stories in Totalitarianism. So Havel's describing the nervous nature and the dead eyes of those he passes on an escalator, saying, "The imperious vanity of the administrative apparatus, its anonymity, the extinction of individual responsibility in the faceless pseudo responsibility of the system, it creates a sensation of helplessness and cripples the will to live one's own life. All that together, and much that is more subtle, lies behind our asthma," referring to the non-story that this guy in prison has asthma, but he hasn't died yet. And Havel is saying the asthma is our story. The disease, in fact, is gnawing man away, keeping it secret, fosters its spread. And Havel would conclude, "I'm instead trying to draw attention to the inconspicuous and unspectacular war that life wages every day against nothingness. I'm attempting to say that the struggle of the story and of history to resist nihilization is in itself a story and belongs to history." So, Flagg, my question is, in a world that has a lot of ideology still brewing about and so on, are the stories of asthma, are they put on the shelf like they were in the time of Havel? Are the stories against nothingness, the stories against nihilization, are they not sexy enough to be publicizing out there? And who will be the teller of those stories if they're not being told?
You mean teller of the stories of Havel's context,
No,
or
no, even more like in an ideological age, which we still experience, there are people that can put their finger on the notion of what's wrong with living in an ideological age, and yet people will say that's not a sexy enough story. How do we keep alive the dangers of living in nothingness, the dangers of living in nihilization in the 21st century?
yeah, yeah. Well, so this brings up something that Havel mentions in Power of the Powerless and some of his other essays, right? Which is Havel thinks both the totalitarian East and the democratic West are both part of what he calls and changes the terminology in different places, but modern technological civilization, modern industrial civilization. And so he thinks part of the danger that the democratic West faces is a kind of consumerism, a kind of turning away from kind of meaningful confrontation with reality and meaningful responsibility, um, because you won't. The temptation isn't ideological in the sense that people are seemingly not attracted to some comprehensive ideological system, some account of history that they think they're going to dedicate their lives to and become a soldier for the revolution for, right? Not that, but a kind of turning away from politics where people will just retreat into their private lives and focus on acquisition, having a nice car,
Yeah.
right? Make sure their preschooler gets into a gazillion-dollar preschool, right? Something like this. And so Havel does think this danger is not something that people in the West can ignore. As to how to combat it, right? I mean, Havel just thinks that living in truth is always an ever present, if repressed, possibility that people need to be reminded of. And so I think that he probably suspects there will be artists around, who can write and get people to appreciate the absurdity of their lives and get people to face situations where they can find meaning where they hadn't been inclined to look for it in the first place. And so I think, Havel, I guess I would say Havel thinks there will be people around who will be inclined to take up that challenge and to write some sort of art or paint or whatever the medium might be to
Yeah.
get people to appreciate this. How those people can be found and promoted, and kind of the cultural institutional support you need. I don't know if Havel ever speaks to that, but I don't think Havel thinks that possibility is ever going to go away. I mean, if it didn't go away in the circumstances of communist Czechoslovakia, right? I think it's
Yeah.
certainly not going to go away in other situations. So I think he's ultimately hopeful.
Yeah, and I'll also say, kind of in some of the other podcasts that I've done in talking to people about Dietrich von Hildebrand and obviously John Paul II, Cardinal Mindszenty, there's so much also of an edifice in Catholicism and faith that can feed kind of uh, an opposition to an ideological mindset and also that can sponsor an interior life that is robust in these circumstances. So also just an ally with the works of Havel as
Yeah,
well.
serious lives of faith, education, artistic endeavor. Havel even has an appreciation in this essay. I hadn't read it in a while, but I was struck by his inclusion of the importance of economic life and private property. Right?
Yeah, yeah,
He talks about the importance of commerce being a real avenue for creativity.
yeah,
Right? And I think, especially on the conservative side, that aspect of conservatism is kind of dismissed
yeah,
now as it's kind of silly, and economics is about these big corporations, and right. I think that's sort of the national conservative ethos, is to be quite dismissive of the importance of commerce and small business and all of that. But Havel seems to think that's an important avenue for human creativity and an avenue for meaning. I mean,
mm-hmm.
that circle, that part of life can can provide people with genuine meaning, right? It's not just, they're not just driven by, I mean, they're certainly driven by the need for a paycheck and to feed their families, but economic life can be about much more than that, according to Havel. I was really struck by that. I hadn't sort of remembered the degree to which he emphasizes that in this essay.
Flag, as we wind down, and you've been so generous with your time, how have you personally been influenced by the life and thoughts of Václav Havel?
Personally, wow. Um, I suppose it's just a reminder to take um, to take your own life and the part you play in various aspects of your life seriously, to really be honest about um, how you conduct yourself, right? How you treat other people, how you live your own life, the things that you affirm in a kind of passive way that you might not even notice that you're affirming, right? You really have to take a hard look at the extent to which you affirm things that you really believe in, and you associate with yourselves with things that you really believe in, and I guess how easy it is to kind of fall away and dissociate kind of your inner purpose and your inner desires from kind of outward behavior. The extent to which how easy it is for those two things to kind of get out of joint with each other. I think that's probably one of his core lessons. I think that just transcends time and place, right? I mean, I think that's something that you can bring into your own life, even if you're not living in communist
Yeah, yeah,
Czechoslovakia.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
and just his, I don't know, I guess I would say he's just very, his just Havel as a writer and artist. He's very funny and just has a kind of joy in communicating things with strange metaphors and getting you to appreciate things in surprising ways. So I guess Havel as an artist or writer, I mean, I think he has important lessons for people who are part of the kind of public intellectual world, that don't take yourself too seriously. Think about giving people joy in what you're trying to communicate to them. I mean, that I love that you led off at that passage um, from Hebrew University. I mean, I think some of that playfulness comes out
Yep.
in that quote, and so a kind of seriousness of purpose for Havel has to go along with this reminder that don't take yourself too seriously. Remember that life can be absurd and bizarre and funny, and you have to kind of be attentive to that too. So kind of Havel as a kind of comedic writer, I think,
Mhm.
has taught me a lot about how we should conduct ourselves and try to communicate with an audience if we want to be appreciated and taken seriously. I mean, to take someone seriously paradoxically might require some humor and having a kind of light touch. So that's another thing I think that he's taught me.
Flag, before we part, I want you to say a word or two about your excellent podcast, Enduring Interest.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah. So this is a podcast that I started a couple years ago, and it's meant to be. I noticed around the time there were tons of podcasts about just published books, and lots of podcasts about great books, right? The Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Ethics, but not much in between. In my own life, there are lots of books and essays that I come across that I kind of want people to know more about, but maybe were not bestsellers, and for whatever reason didn't find the audience that they deserved when they were initially published. So that was the original germ of
Mm,
the podcast. And then the second thing I do with it is to kind of group books and essays around a particular theme. And so we'll do a series on. I did the first series I did was on totalitarianism and ideology. So I had 6 or 7 episodes on that. So we're currently in the midst of a series of podcasts on books and essays on free speech and censorship. And so the first one we did was with a great author called Jonathan Rausch, who wrote a book, I think it came out in 1992, called Kindly Inquisitors, which is a really concise, compelling case for free speech. it's meant to kind of give people the feel of kind of being involved almost in a mini course, right?
Hmm.
If you've
Hmm.
listened to the full
Yep.
full series, you'll get a sense for the range of arguments on all sides of an issue. And so yeah, it's been a great pleasure, and have a lot of good guests like your podcast. I try to bring in people like Daniel Mahoney and Gary Saul Morrison. I've intended to have on, who I know who's been on your podcast. So try to get lots of interesting people to talk about interesting books that they're passionate about and they want to kind of tell people about because they think they haven't been, again, found the audience that they've deserved. So that's been the kind of basic purpose of the podcast.
Terrific podcast. Check out Enduring Interest on all the various podcast platforms that are out there. Dr. Flagg Taylor, professor, scholar, and expert on totalitarianism and dissent. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation. I really appreciate you having me on, and it's really fun to talk about Havel in general, and then these essays in particular. I was really glad to have a chance to talk, especially about stories in totalitarianism, less well known, but deserves a wider audience.
So I've been thinking. It wasn't until I came across Václav Havel's earth shaking essay, The Power of the Powerless, that I had any sense of the nature of a dissident. A dissident is an individual who actively dissents from the policy or philosophy of a ruling power, often at great risk to him or herself. In their opposition, dissidents can be either peaceful or violent, active or passive, but it often involves the championing of scintillating ideas as the cure for a drab, gray, and oppressive culture. Now, to be honest with you, I was thunderstruck by the power of the powerless. This is because the essay didn't simply expose the nefarious intricacies and devious subtleties of totalitarian rule. Rather, it accurately diagnosed the nuances, good, bad, or ugly, of human nature that emerge when people try to cope with oppression. Totalitarian regimes are distinct from authoritarian regimes. To be sure, authoritarian regimes want to secure power and fashion a society according to their priorities. But authoritarians aim less at ideological overhaul and more at resource domination. If you simply don't threaten the authoritarian leader, regardless of what you truly think on the inside, you often will simply be left alone. Power is what really matters. Totalitarian regimes, on the other hand, will not settle for simple power. They want your soul. Totalitarian regimes often begin their rule purging religious leaders and non aligned intellectuals, poets, and playwrights. Anything that smacks of religion, an allegiance to another world and an alternative dogma, or culture, like novels, poems, or plays that reflect on a life other than that which the totalitarian has tailor made, must be fully eradicated. Authoritarians shoot their opposition. Totalitarians harass, humiliate, and torture their opposition until the opposition agrees with the regime, and then they shoot them. Authoritarians want you to own your body, totalitarians want to own your soul. The Power of the Powerless and Stories in Totalitarianism reveal how totalitarian regimes atomize society, make everyone suspicious, if not fearful, of everyone else, and incentivize people to betray their own conscience in the name of safety or opportunism. These essays also explore the hunger such individuals have for courage and dignity while being plagued with a tendency towards conformity and self doubt. In its devilish schemes, totalitarian regimes draft you against yourself and make you an unwitting sponsor of the nightmare in which you are trapped. But it doesn't have to be this way. Havel reminds that we have a choice. Do you want to live within a lie, he asks, or live within the truth? Havel consoles us that it is understandable to be afraid, to recognize the risk of saying something or doing something that runs counter to the totalitarian orthodoxy. But he also tells us that sometimes to be truly courageous, you don't need to thump your chest, bark through a megaphone, and get dragged off to jail. Sometimes you can simply and quietly refuse to put the regime's propaganda sign, "Workers of the World Unite," in your storefront window. Totalitarian ideology has not disappeared with the Nazis, the fascists, or the communists. The impulse that dark forces have to control our soul has not been relegated to the dustbin of history. It is alive and well today. And that makes the writings of dissidents like Václav Havel and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Leszek Kolakowski and Arthur Koestler, as well as the ideas and witness of St. John Paul II, St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, and St. Maximilian Kolbe supremely relevant and desperately important today. Once again, a dissident is an individual who actively dissents from the policy or philosophy of a ruling power, often at great risk to him or herself. But what is the risk of conforming to totalitarian rule? Everything. Perhaps George Bernanot said it best. Quote, I believe, in fact, I am certain that many men never give out the whole of themselves, their deepest truth. They live on the surface, and yet so rich is the soil of humanity that even this thin outer layer is able to yield a kind of meager harvest that gives the illusion of real living. I've heard that during the last war, timid little clerks would turn out to be real leaders. Without knowing it, they had in them the passion to command. How many men will never have the least idea of what is meant by supernatural heroism, without which there can be no inner life? Therefore, when death has bereft them of all the artificial props with which society provides such people, they will find themselves as they really are, as they were without even knowing it. Horrible, undeveloped monsters, the stumps of men. Close quote. Without doubt, there is risk in being a dissident in a wrong-headed totalitarian culture, but there is greater risk in complicity. We are called to supernatural heroism. In a totalitarian world of unbelief, the faithful saints are dissidents, and so were the courageous figures like Václav Havel. In being a dissident, what did they save? Their dignity, their integrity, and perhaps, with the grace of God, their souls. And one last thing. Be sure to read Václav Havel's essays, The Power of the Powerless, and Stories and Totalitarianism, but also check out Flagg Taylor's The Great Lie, classic and recent appraisals of ideology and totalitarianism. It is an unparalleled collection of original essays and speeches hammered out by dissidents and cultural commentators about the darkness of totalitarianism and the luminosity of man. Without doubt, this is a must-have book for anyone contemplating truth in a world of ideological falsehood. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization and Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.